18 IWOP thinking. How does tension turn into action? Welcome to Self-Development Psychology. Do you remember in our last class when we compared the development of thinking to a river? A river needs 3 conditions to flow. The first condition is the tension produced by the drop in the river, which is the creative goal we talked about in the last class. However, this alone is not enough. Tension is not so comfortable because it keeps us in a state of tension. In this lecture and the next, we will look at the second condition for the flow of the riverbed. Let's think about how to turn tension into our own driving force. Today, I will introduce a special way of thinking that increases our motivation, WOP thinking. Have you ever experienced feeling guilty about your own inactivity, and then naturally made a decision or plan? After making a decision, you feel better about yourself, and the tension is naturally released. As a result, the motivation for action decreases. Sometimes, we buy many books but never read them, we buy gym memberships but never go, we buy many courses but don't listen carefully. In the past, you might have thought that your willpower was not enough to persist. Now you know that buying books, memberships, and courses itself has a purpose, which is to relieve the anxiety brought by the goal. The brain cannot distinguish between plans and decisions and what is truly action. Sometimes, because we have made a decision and a plan, the brain mistakenly thinks that we have already done it, and the tension for action is reduced. There is a saying that people need positive and optimistic fantasies to provide hope for our actions. So when something encounters difficulties, we always imagine overcoming the difficulties and achieving the results. However, from the perspective of tension, positive and optimistic fantasies may not be so good. Because it may reduce your motivation for action. For example, a study found that girls who fantasized about successfully losing weight had much lower weight loss results than those who fantasized about encountering difficulties. Another problem that positive fantasies can bring is that when we feel threatened by our fantasies, we try our best to avoid contact with reality to protect our fantasies. The most typical example is that if you are a very capable person in your fantasy, you will be afraid to accept challenges because if you fail, your fantasy cannot continue. You may ask, but positive fantasies are not without benefits. Without a beautiful expectation for the future, where do we get the motivation to act? After all, many studies have shown that optimism can indeed help people create more possibilities. Psychological contrast method: think of benefits first, then obstacles. Because optimistic fantasies can bring both hope and problems, there is a psychological method that combines optimism and pessimism, called the psychological contrast method. What is the psychological contrast method? It is to prevent overly optimistic fantasies from reducing our tension. We need to imagine where the obstacles to achieving our wishes are while imagining optimistic prospects. Let's imagine the moment when our wishes are fulfilled, and then pour cold water on ourselves to face reality. Let me give you an example. I have a friend who studied computer science and went to an IT company to work as a technical support after graduation. But he felt that technical support was not creative and not what he wanted to do. He wanted to be a product manager. This is an unfulfilled goal with a lot of tension. Perhaps you have heard the advice to do some positive imagining how you will be as a product manager. But that's not enough. According to the psychological contrast method, on the one hand, you need to imagine the scene after your wish is fulfilled. For example, you design a great product that many people use, and you enjoy your work. On the other hand, you also need to imagine the obstacles you may encounter when transitioning to a product manager. For example, you need to learn a lot of new things, change your way of thinking, and get closer to colleagues who make products to see if there are such job opportunities. This is the method of psychological contrast, first imagining optimistic results, and then imagining the obstacles that may be encountered on the way. There is already a lot of research showing that the motivation generated by psychological contrast is much greater than just doing positive imagining or just thinking about negative obstacles. It should be noted that the order of psychological contrast is important. We need to think about the benefits first and then the possible obstacles. If you think about difficulties first and then the possible benefits, you are likely to focus on the obstacles, and the tension of the goal has not been established yet. You will feel overwhelmed by difficulties, which will also hinder your actions. The biggest advantage of psychological contrast is that it preserves the tension brought by the goal through optimistic fantasies, while also bringing the fantasy into reality, making the goal truly connected to reality. Like the friend who wants to transition to a product manager, when he imagines the obstacles he may encounter, these obstacles actually suggest the real path to becoming a product manager, learning new skills, changing his way of thinking, and finding new job opportunities. If the tension established by his goal is effective, then this tension can be used to overcome these real difficulties, rather than being consumed in fantasy. However, psychological contrast also has a problem. It requires us to imagine both optimistic results and possible obstacles, but it does not tell us how to overcome obstacles. Many times, we cannot take action because the imagined obstacles give us too much pressure and make us want to avoid them, which leads to procrastination. Don't worry, let's continue.